Um, so I want to warn you today that the topic I'm about to discuss is one that, when I go in that direction, a lot of people tend to assume that I'm some sort of a communist. Nothing could be further from the truth. I adore business. I'm deeply attached to it. I do not believe that successful societies can exist without a thriving business sector. At the same time, I also understand that free market is an oxymoron. A free market is a place where the biggest, strongest person bops you over the head and takes what they want. Markets cannot exist without law, and business cannot exist without law. And in order to understand what makes business contribute to social welfare, because of course, in my view, that's what business is about. It's about improving our lives. And by the way, it's brilliant at that when it's structured properly. But it has to be structured properly, and to do that, we need to be very realistic and very informed about what business really is. And my thesis today is that collectively, we may have made a dreadful mistake over the past 20, 30 years in misunderstanding what business really is, and especially what the public corporation really is. And I want to give you an example, I think, of how that mistake has actually impeded the ability of business to make our lives better. And the example is BP. You probably remember that on April 20th in 2010, an oil well that BP was drilling in the Gulf of Mexico suddenly exploded. And the oil rig, the Deepwater Horizon, went up in a column of fire that burned for 2 days before it finally collapsed into the depths of the Gulf of Mexico, killing 11 people and beginning the worst oil spill in, I believe, the history of humanity. This was a disaster on a scale that's very hard to imagine. But it was especially a disaster for BP shareholders themselves. BP shares had been trading around $60 a share US before the Deepwater Horizon explosion, and within a month or so afterwards, they had been halved to $30 a share. A loss in BP's market capitalization of $100 billion. Of course, the calamity was by no means confined to reductions in the value of BP shares. BP bonds were also severely damaged as they were downgraded to almost junk bond status. Other oil companies' shares were harmed because in the wake of the spill, President Obama imposed a moratorium on all drilling in the Gulf, which of course is bad for all the other corporations that were seeking oil in the Gulf. It was bad for corporations that were in the tourism industry in the Gulf. It was bad for the fishing industry in the Gulf. It was bad for individuals who owned real estate in the area of the Gulf. It was bad for individuals who were employed in the fishing and the tourism industries in the Gulf. It was bad for people who like to eat fish from the Gulf. And it was bad for anyone who wanted to enjoy the recreational facilities of the Gulf ecosystem. And finally, it was obviously very bad for the Gulf ecosystem itself.
It was 2 years ago tonight that the Deepwater Horizon oil rig blew up in the Gulf of Mexico off Louisiana. 11 workers were killed, and it caused the largest accidental oil spill in history. 200 million gallons of crude gushed out of the BP well before it was capped nearly 3 months later. We were curious about the spill's effects, so we asked Elaine Quijano to look into it.
Troy Frady runs a charter fishing boat off the Alabama Gulf Coast. Since the oil spill, he's been worried about some of the red snapper he's catching.
1% to 2% of the fish had these huge lesions on them and fin rot, and we've never seen that before.
Researchers at the University of Florida are trying to determine what's causing the problem.
You can't spill that much oil into a system without having long-term negative consequences.
David Muth is with the advocacy group, the National Wildlife Federation. He took us to an island where weeks after the spill, pelicans were covered with oil. Muth says oil is suffocating mangroves, holding the soil in place. It was 4 acres before. How big is the island now?
It's less than an acre. 75% loss of the island since the spill.
What do you think this will look like in another 2 years?
Gone.
Completely gone.
Completely gone.
2 years later, the oil is still here in some parts of these marshlands. You can actually see it in places in these tar patches, and in other areas the ground is so saturated you can actually see the oil bubbling up from the ground. Penn State scientists say this dead coral contained the chemical fingerprint of the BP oil. The red you see are starfish. Dolphins also show signs of distress. Last year in Louisiana, federal researchers say 179 dolphins were stranded, nearly 8 times the average. It's not clear whether the oil played a role. BP has spent $14 billion on environmental cleanup, and in a statement today told us there is still work to be done, and any and all conclusions about the health of the Gulf should be based on responsible science. The Food and Drug Administration says it has extensively tested Gulf seafood and it's safe to eat. But fisherman Troy Frady believes the Gulf is still struggling.
It's going to take many years of restoration in the Gulf of Mexico to get it back to where it's healthy.
BP says it's committed to the largest and most complex study of the Gulf ever done. It's a study with high stakes for all involved. Elaine Quijano, CBS News, Barataria Bay, Louisiana.
How could a disaster happen on such a massive scale? The United States government organized a commission to investigate, and what they concluded was that the ultimate cause of the disaster was BP's desire to cut safety corners in order to save money. Each day that BP was drilling without putting the well into full operation was costing them $1 million. So in order to save $1 million a day, they ended up sacrificing $100 billion in shareholder wealth alone. No matter how you do the math, this was an enormous mistake. How could it have been made? My hypothesis is that one of the ultimate causes of the BP oil spill was what I call shareholder value thinking. And shareholder value thinking possesses the business world today, especially publicly listed companies. And it drives executives and directors to focus relentlessly on trying to get their share price up, not 10 years from now, not even 5 years from now, 3 months from now, tomorrow, if possible. And in the quest to raise share price, we see companies do what BP did. They cut safety corners, they reduce workplace safety, they make other poor decisions, they cut back on customer support, they reduce expenditures on research and development. And a consulting firm in the United States published the results of a survey last year in which they interviewed chief financial officers of listed companies and said, would you undertake an investment in a project that would produce net present value, positive net present value over 3 to 5 years if you thought it would harm your quarterly earnings? And 85% of the CFOs said no, we would not make that long-term investment if it harmed our short-term ability to meet our earnings estimates. Not only do companies resist long-term investments, they fail to take adequate care of their customers. They fail to take adequate care of and to invest in their employees. They take on risks, and we've certainly seen this in the U.S. financial sector. They leverage up their firms in the hopes that if things go well, they'll produce an enormous profit, and with the assurance that if things go very poorly indeed, much of the loss will be borne by their bondholders, by their customers, by their employees, but not ultimately by the shareholders themselves.